So my archenemy Ruse Crews over at Goblin Inc recently put out a video essay on their current concerns for the Necromancer class, especially walking into the expansion in Season 6. I'm going to include a link down to the video below if you want to go ahead and check it out. You absolutely should. Give it an upvote. I think it's really important for especially people within the sphere of influence for the Necromancer class to bring up concerns and to give critique and feedback. Because for a very long time, while it was kind of fun when the game first released, I've had to say just straight up out loud, the Necromancer is the underdog, the Necromancer is one of the worst classes, and I think it's only by the continued pressure to be able to highlight these issues that any good changes come to the class, so that the developers are more aware of the pain points that we as the players have. Now, I had sat down and met with Ruse about this very document right here. We actually sat down for like 4 or 5 hours, I think it was, going through the initial rough draft of the various issues that they perceived in the class. I would give my feedback. I helped them to rewrite some of the parts. And what I basically wanted to do was sharpen their critique so that it was as valuable as it could possibly be. Luckily, though, they didn't just talk to me. They talked to a ton of amazing creators, very specifically in the Necro space, who have, at this point now, over a year of experience with that class. So again, go ahead and check out the video if you want to hear the entirety of it. It's only about 8 minutes and won't take you very long. But the premise of the video that they boiled it down to, which is less than what we had initially talked about, was ultimately the skill tree itself, where they are saying that the majority of the problems that the class experiences comes from that set disease. Like if we were to think about what you see as problems are really the symptoms of a disease state. And the disease being that the skill tree underperforms, is underwhelming, has very little connective tissue, and ultimately doesn't allow for a lot of ingenuity, build diversity, because at the end of the day, you don't have a lot of options. And I think that there is a kernel of truth in this premise, but there's basically one major twist I want to put on it where I think I can add additional insight into this. The worst part about the Necromancer skill tree is that it actually has an incredible amount of diversity, but only for one thing. I've recently been playing the Shadow Surfer Necromancer. The Shadow Surfer Necromancer kind of spits in the face of the entire argument that Ruse is trying to put together, but when in reality, it highlights the kernel issue to such a degree that it's almost upsetting to play this build because of how cool it is, because of how different it is, because of how little it really bends to the will of the lack of options in the Necromancer skill tree. And what it shows us is the fact that this is the only exception to the rule. Shadow Surfer, which I put out a video recently, I guess I'll link to it here. I really don't want to interrupt the flow of this video, but if you haven't seen it, you should watch that video because you can even just check out the gameplay in the beginning, but it will show you a very different Necromancer experience than you really had anywhere else because of how unique and how interesting it is. But for people who haven't seen that video or don't know what Shadow Surfer is, Ultimate Shadow morphs the ultimate skills Bone Storm and Blood Wave to be darkness skills, which deal shadow damage as opposed to their physical damage they dealt previously, and in addition to that, now apply a damage over time effect. One of them comes with a new keyword called Desecrated Ground, which is the Necromancer's minor power, similar to how the Sorceress has Ice Shards and the Barbarian has Dust Devils. Because of the constraints of how the aspect works, if you actually want the damage over time to do damage, you put it onto a two-handed weapon. If you don't, you can just put it into a less important slot, like a one-hander, leaving open your amulet for more damage. But adding on these different skill tags and fundamentally changing the functionality of the skill is something the Necromancer is missing in a meaningful way. And everything that we have in the skill tree is completely isolated. And in that sense, I 100% agree with Ruse. I agree with the video that he's put out on Goblin Inc. But let me just toss my own spin onto it, so I'm not just repeating what they said, and let me walk you through that problem. There are 4 colors in the Necromancer skill tree. There is purple, that's your darkness skills, which deal shadow damage. There is red, these are your blood skills, which deal physical damage. And then there is white, these are your bone skills, which do physical damage. Last important color is this aquamarine, almost teal, and these are your minion colors. These are your golems and your skeletons along with Army of the Dead. If you are building any form of Necromancer build other than Shadow Surfer, You paint by colors in your skill tree, and you will come out with the same build as 99% of the player base. Back when we had to use a generator skill, if you were a darkness build, you picked either Reap or Decompose, when in reality you just picked Reap, and that's because it actually brought any utility to your build at all, and it said that it generated a corpse, as well as providing you damage reduction, something Necromancer needs desperately. Coming down into the next node of the skill tree with your core skills, you either decided whether or not you were doing damage over time, or you were doing critical strike / vulnerable damage. If you're doing damage over time, you take Blight. If you're doing critical strike damage, you take Sever. Now, if you were misguided by what the Shadow Blight key passive represents for the Necromancer, this idea of a duality between crit and damage over time, you might try to do both of them, or use something like Empowered Reaper as an aspect slot. You'd eventually learn that this was a giant mistake, but you'd figure it out. Now, I forgot to touch on two other colors that are in the skill tree, and it's because these actually just fall into the concept of utility, and it doesn't necessarily matter what color they are, other than the fact that you can actually change these colors as well. We have green. This represents your corpse base skills, Corpse Explosion and Corpse Tendrils, as well as any of your passives which work with corpses. Now, the cool part that used to exist for Corpse Explosion is that by taking Blighted, you could turn Corpse Explosion purple as well, meaning that it would fill into your damage over time ability. Sadly, the overprevalence of use of Corpse Explosion has basically made it so that you only use this to literally consume corpses for bonuses in the Paragon board, as well as this very specific passive node here, and you can't effectively scale its damage. While you could try to, it just vastly underperforms anything else, and that's a second part of the video that I want to touch on, is the underwhelmingness of the Necromancer skill tree. But then the other color in our skill tree are our curses, ones that have their own passive. We have multiple aspects that change the effectiveness of your curses, when in reality, you take Decrepify because Decrepify says reduce your cooldowns, as well as slow down monsters, as well as provide damage reduction, as well as apply a way of being able to stun monsters. And if you're leveling up, you use Iron Maiden because it says generate essence. Outside of that, there is no choice to be made between these two things. You will use Decrepify, and in reality, the only time that you benefit from Iron Maiden in the end game is when an aspect, most notably the Cursed Aura aspect, will apply it for free, because you would never waste your time putting it on your skill bar, which you already don't have enough space for, or actually clicking the skill itself. And then we get down to our passives. Now, Ruse made a really good point here. We have some of the most restricted and insular passives in the game. These passives, which are red-coded, so you know they mean blood, only work for blood skills. They do not modify the behavior of anything else. This says when you hit with a blood skill. This says when your blood skill overpowers. And this says when you are healthy and you have a blood skill. Lastly, the ability to generate blood orbs as a lucky hit mechanic, which could be available to any one of the Necromancer builds, opening up the ability to build into blood orbs as either a utility or nope, this also only works with your blood skills. Now here is where we start to get a little bit of a shine. We saw it a little bit with Corpse Explosion, but we get another little bit of a shine of building into niche interactions between our skills here in the form of Corpse Tendrils. Corpse Tendrils is just great utility. In fact, it is such good utility with one of the strongest aspects in the game tied to it that you will use it on every single build. Ruse was completely true on that. The only build that doesn't use this is a build that can't physically generate corpses, which is in the form of Blood Surge, which is kind of funny. It went from being our weakest build to one of our strongest builds, and it doesn't use one of our strongest skills because it can't even afford to. There's some kind of irony there. Corpse Tendrils either allowed you to apply Vulnerable, which is something the Necromancer is very good at doing naturally and has gotten better as the game has iterated and added more stats to the game. But this was the bread and butter of activating the majority of damage bonuses for the Necromancer for a very long time, along with the aspect Grasping Veins, which adds on critical strike chance and another damage multiplier. Or you can use it to generate blood orbs, something that helped it to more efficiently and better benefit builds which were seeking to generate blood orbs, because it was our only option of doing so outside of the Blood Tree's natural ability to generate them, only for Bloodlance very specifically, because Blood Surge also neither can generate blood orbs naturally nor interact with them naturally, which is like a whole other problem. But this right here kind of indicates the idea that the Necromancer skills were meant to mesh together, and maybe they just couldn't find enough opportunities to make that a reality. But the same issues that you see for the blood passives, you see in the shadow passives as well. This only works if you attack with a darkness skill. Luckily, Gloom says that after hitting somebody with a darkness skill, it increases your shadow damage. So even though your key passive, which is not a darkness skill, but does do shadow damage, can't activate this bonus. Once you have it, it does work for it. But interestingly enough, Terror, the one at the end of the tree, actually can interact with any type of shadow damage that you do. It doesn't need to be a darkness skill, but another lucky hit ability very specifically requires a darkness skill to activate it. Going down into the bone passives is another single example where you can benefit from them on a different skill type. You can't care about your bone skill crit chance if you don't want to do damage with it. You don't care about the bone skill damage because it only increases the critical strike of bone skill damage. And then Evulsion only says your bone skills will do more crit damage for its vulnerable targets. But it's in rapid ossification that, and this is kind of funny in this way, you can actually benefit on other builds like Bloodlance or Blood Surge or anything that is looking to spend essence very quickly to be able to reduce the cooldowns of your bone skills, because the last issue that I kind of want to touch on is the fact that the ultimate skills are kind of nothing, and as well as our key passives are kind of nothing. But Bone Storm, being the most prolific and prevalent, overused, and overpowered of our ultimates, basically finds its way onto every single Necromancer build. And rapid ossification is a cool way for you to be able to interact with that skill to make it available more often for builds that otherwise wouldn't have an avenue of doing that. And while I've been a little bit ranty here, let's get back to the concept of colors here. You'll notice that we only have 3 ultimate skills. You can't paint by colors here. You either have a blood skill, have a minion skill, or have a bone skill. Now, luckily, the paint by colors thing leading you astray here is a bit of an illusion. You just use Bone Storm. Bone Storm, on paper, just says that like you and your minions can gain benefits of an AoE damage effect. And that damage used to be pseudo-relevant. Back before the game has like vastly crept past the relevance of this scaling damage here. But in the gaining of damage reduction, the gaining of critical strike chance, and then the addition of the aspect Shielding Storm, which was buffed in Season 5, you can gain near permanent invulnerability to damage and infinite survivability as long as you have Bone Storm up. So every single build that wants to use Bone Storm probably wants to reset the cooldown of Bone Storm as fast as possible, and will go out of its way to sacrifice damage and efficiency just to have 100% uptime on Bone Storm, just to be able to survive. Nearly half of the survivability that endgame builds enjoy on the Necromancer is because of this one ultimate skill. Now, in our example of Shadow Surfer, we're able to take Blood Wave and manipulate it into a darkness skill. It does shadow damage, has a damage over time component to it. You can either scale its shadow damage over time, which does a pretty decent job of applying fairly high amounts of damage, actually outperformed Corpse Explosion in Season 4. But in the way that I'm using it on Shadow Surfer, I'm actually just adding those tags to the build to be able to abuse or ignore the paint by colors description I gave you earlier. Because it's a darkness skill, it can now increase my movement speed. It can now grant me a lucky hit chance to be able to stun. It can now trigger Gloom so I get additional shadow damage, and also benefits from Terror since this naturally slows down targets, which is one of the things that activates Terror. And we're able to take our skill tree and interweave it in an interesting way. That's the only example, and it really stinks, but that's the only example. I could go on and on and on about the ultimate skills, but 1, they are not nearly interesting enough. 2, outside of Blood Wave just now in Season 5, none of them do enough damage to really be considered like an ultimate skill for the purposes of like DPSing down a boss or clearing out a huge room. All of this, though, culminates in our key passives, which I would argue at this point, now that the game has developed and we've become very comfortable in the class and we've seen what other classes can do, are truly the least inspired options for key passives that any class has. If you are a minion build, you will use Kalan's Edict because it says your minions gain attack speed. Now, Ruse very rightfully points out that even in the end-to-end game, you can still optimize into being able to apply shadow damage at a high enough rate to be able to get a 50% damage multiplier through using Shadow Blight and the Blighted aspect. But what you'll see is that for a key passive, something that's supposed to define the build and define the ultimate like terminus, the ultimate cohesion of your skill tree, the key passive just says only your minions gain some attack speed. While significantly better than Kalan's Edict was in the past, which used to say if you had not taken damage within the last 3 seconds, I would believe, they would gain some attack speed, and it was doubled if you had 7 or more minions. A key passive probably shouldn't say just your minions gain some attack speed. Similarly, Ossified Essence, arguably one of the strongest key passives in the game, just says you get more damage for building a bone build competently. So right now, even though I haven't built into it, just clicking this and then casting Bone Spear, I would gain a 41% damage multiplier. While powerful, and it's been nerfed in the past. It used to be even stronger than this. There's nothing to build into. Bone skills just tell you to build into maximum essence. And then the key passive says, good job, you built it competently, here's a damage multiplier. Now, Rathma's Vigor, I believe, is actually interesting. It says that if you play the mini game of picking up blood orbs and generating blood orbs, you'll be able to overpower every single time that you cast a skill, as long as you played the mini game of blood orbs. On top of that, even if you're not really playing the mini game, it says at the very least every 12 seconds you are going to overpower. So you can at least bank on overpowering. Now, sadly, it's only for your blood skills. So it's not like you can build into Rathma's Vigor, be able to build like a Sever Overpower build. You can't interact with Overpower for skills that can't overpower 100% of the time, other than Blood Wave, Bone Spirit, oddly enough, the best Overpower build that the Necromancer has, and then the 2 blood skills. So while Rathma's Vigor is interesting, it adds a minigame perspective to the Necromancer, and it rewards you for being able to build in a way that would make this as efficient as possible. The better you are at doing it, the better returns that you see. It's still pigeonholed into only working for one type of skill. And then we have Shadow Blight. Shadow Blight offering another type of minigame, except this one you don't actually build into. You're not rewarded for building into it. And at the end of the day, the only reason why we ever used it, unironically, when it first came out, it just said if you had dealt shadow damage to a target and they had Shadow Blight on them, they would take 10% more damage. So at the very least, you could like click this and then find a way of adding Blight to your skill bar. But they took that away. And what they did was make the actual effect stronger. Sadly, the effect is so weak that even fully building into it isn't really a competent build. You can see my Shade Mist video where I put this up not too long ago, where I tried that very thing, triggering Shadow Blight at the highest rate possible, building into Shadow Blight's damage completely, and it still underperformed. It's not unplayable, but it's so underwhelming that building into it is a lot more of like a noob trap than anything else. But we used Shadow Blight to be able to build into the blighted aspect, something that gave you an incredible amount of power, regardless of the build type that you had. Meaning that if you solved the puzzle of Shadow Blight on minions, you'd gain the biggest damage multiplier that the Necromancer had. In fact, the biggest multiplier that most classes had. There were so many times that Shadow Blight would have overperformed the ability to overpower more often before Rathma's Vigor was buffed, that every single time I put together a blood build, I would ask the question, can I successfully trigger Shadow Blight? Can I play this minigame? Can I change the dynamic of my build? Can I warp it? Be able to benefit from this key passive in an interesting way to gain this damage bonus. You would ask it on basically every single build that the Necromancer had. And while I think that that ultimately is not necessarily healthy, and the developers agreed clearly because they nerfed Blighted into the ground, making it so underwhelming that even shadow builds don't use it. They actually just have better options for the same amount of damage output at a higher rate, which is another problem that I've already made videos on in the past. But Shadow Blight had this intermingling, had this interweaving or warping of your build expectations in Theorycraft that I think is a healthy exercise for the majority of players to have gone through and tried to figure out whether or not it was something they could or could not do. And that's been taken away. Shadow Blight underperforms, does not truly bring anything to a build, and still right now is just a question of, do you need a 50% damage multiplier from Blighted? So I agree with Ruse that ultimately, at the end of the day, the skill tree is at fault for a lot of the frustrations that Necromancer players feel. And now, while I don't want to rant about it for too long, because I had one more point to make, and I promise I'll let you go here, it's the unique items that change the base effect of skills, and the fact that there's no parity between them. This Visage says that your Bone Spirit leaves behind explosions. These explosions are so strong when you use a two-handed weapon to scale the base damage of it, that it can outperform the damage of the spears themselves, because it double dips on critical strike damage. Not only does crit damage just increase how much it's going to do when it crits, but it also acts as a secondary multiplier. So the more critical strike damage you put on, the larger you increase two different buckets, one of them being a completely unique damage multi. On top of the fact that the explosions from Bone Spear that it leaves behind also interact with things like the lucky hit system. So they actually carry the lucky hit chance of your Bone Spear and can trigger vulnerable, can trigger stun, can stagger bosses, can trigger Endariel's Visage to apply poison damage if you really want to. They can trigger Fist of Fate to be able to apply every single crowd control, which is not something that can be said of Ebon Piercer. Ebon Piercer's bolts are so strong that the Blight projectile itself represents anywhere between 1/10 and 1/15 of your total damage output, meaning that properly building into Ebon Piercer means you don't build into Blight's damage at all. You just build into the things that scale Ebon Piercer's damage. But what we noticed in the PTR before Season 4 is that Ebon Piercer's bolts were carrying the lucky hit chance of Blight and were triggering at a near 100% coefficient. That was taken away because unique items and things that alter them or add on effects to your skills are not meant to trigger lucky hit chance. That's actually a bug. But even something as silly as Death Speaker's Amulet, which is actually like so decent at this point just from the stats, you can kind of put it on as a near terminus endgame amulet and still get a huge amount of return from it. But the blood surges that are triggered off of Death Speaker's Pendant, which don't scale with your minions in any way, it scales off of the Necromancer itself, also trigger lucky hit chance, also benefit from your overpower, carry along all the characteristics of the skill itself. But Ebon Piercer does not. So even between the different, really way too strong and overperforming unique items that the class has, which I think there's going to be a lot of different opinion here. I think some people are going to like that because unique items should be build defining. I personally think that if a build is gatekept behind a unique property or a unique item, that is a problem, because that doesn't mean I'm going to build Blight. I'm going to build Ebon Piercer. And at that point, why am I using the skill itself other than as like a mechanism of triggering these things? I could go on and on about it, but even between these like build breakingly strong unique items, you don't get the same amount of build breaking strength from each of them. If Ebon Piercer's bolts still triggered lucky hit chance, Ebon Piercer would be one of the strongest S tier builds right now because of how wildly powerful that is. And it shouldn't, but that's the difference between a slight mechanical difference. Ebon Piercer doesn't do lucky hit, Death Speaker's Pendant does, Deathless Visage does. There's something wrong there. But sadly, right now at the end of the day, our skill tree is the smallest skill tree. Our key passives, I believe, are the least inspired out of all the other classes. Our skills don't realistically scale or do damage in comparison to their contemporaries or counterparts. The only ways that you can abuse any of the mechanics that we naturally have available to us is in reaching 100% critical strike chance, 100% uptime on vulnerable, and then whether or not you can successfully overpower. And that starts to trim down the types of builds that ultimately will be at the top end of the meta performance. Now we have a lot of really cool things you can technically do. We have Bone Splinter's Necromancer, our single basic skill build, which actually doesn't even cast a basic skill. It casts Bone Spirit that just so happens to shoot out a lot of basic skill bolts. We have Shadow Surfer, a thing that I think is ultimately fairly interesting to do, whether or not you do the overpower version of it, which I think is ultimately the strongest version, or you dip into the damage over time one, which is at least competent, held back by a couple bugs, like Desecrated Ground not being able to stack on top of one another. Yes, that is a bug. Yes, the devs are aware. But it's at least interesting and powerful enough even without that, where it was one of our top performing builds in Season 4. But you'll notice that the list of truly imaginative, truly inspirational, and truly not game-breaking, but at least meta-shifting things that you can do. Oh, and there's also like Blood Artisan's Cures, right? Like shoutouts to Scribblet and Spirit Wave. Very interesting, very cool. At the end of the day, it is a very roundabout way of being able to cast Bone Spirit, but it's awesome that you can do it in that way. And I would like more things to be available that let us build into that type of stuff. That's kind of the end of the list. There's a pretty major list of issues that I think at the core of it are negatively impacting the Necromancer's ability to scale and to be considered meta. The ironic statement being that we also are pushing the furthest in solo pits at this point on Bone Spirit, but that's the only build that's even vaguely close to performing at that level for the class itself. And we have been the underdogs the whole time. I know people always used to cry about the Barbarian not being good enough. The Druid just keeps getting absolutely dumped on all the time. And sometimes the Sorceress doesn't do damage. But then you come back over to the Necromancer, and the best things that we can show you are the slowest builds in the game, the clunkiest builds in the game, the least intuitive, the most bug-ridden, and it's never gaining infinite damage or leveling 30 times because the rogue got a cool new toy. It's just things that undermine our ability to output damage, survivability, clunkiness, and generally not working the ways that they're supposed to, or in ways that you would expect them to be able to scale past. This was a very long form video. Sorry, Ruse, you did it in a much shorter time, but I think that you broached a very important topic. And while it might be a little bit too late for a lot of these pain points to be put into the hands of the developers for changes to every single issue that we might have walking into the expansion, I'm truly hopeful. One, I just don't believe the leaks. From what I have seen, even just like playing the Spiritborn and how much different the game was, even experiencing that and that one test build during the world premiere, there's no way that these classes and the systems in this game are not getting overhauled in some meaningful ways, because for the Spiritborn to exist, even just things as simple as block chance and block mechanics and thorns are now completely different. So I have hope. But I do think that if we walk into the expansion and even half of this laundry list of issues are still on the table for the Necromancer, then the class has a lot of work and a long way to go before it can be taken out of this conversation. And we can just start getting into what things are slightly underperforming, what things are slightly overperforming, and what are the best ways of going about to change that. And if the developers vibe with that, maybe we would see those things go in. I am hopeful. I am looking forward to the expansion. I do think the class has a lot of work to be done. I'd like to hear from you as well. If you made it all the way to the end here, first off, you're an absolute general. You're an absolute soldier. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already and leave a like on it as well. It would help a lot of other people to be able to participate in this discourse because at the end of the day, Ruse is just one dude. I'm just one dude. And I only think that it's by rising up all of our voices here that we can be heard and we can hope to make some good impact. Let me know down in the comments what you think. I'd love to hear from you. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that in the future it helps you out, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.